what Roman marriage was really like. It's worse than you think.
Picture this. You're a 12-year-old girl in ancient Rome. Your father has just informed you that tomorrow you'll be married to a man 3 times your age, whom you've never met. You have no choice in the matter. Your wedding night will be with a complete stranger, and if you're lucky enough to survive childbirth in the coming years, you might live to see 30.
This isn't a nightmare scenario. This was Tuesday in ancient Rome. We've all seen Hollywood's version of Roman romance. The passionate affairs, the dramatic love stories, the powerful couples ruling empires together. But the reality of Roman marriage was far darker, more brutal, and more shocking than anything Hollywood would dare to show. Today, we're diving deep into what Roman marriage was actually like, and trust me, it's going to make you grateful you weren't born 2,000 years ago. You're watching Chapters in History. Subscribe now for the stories in history. Chapter 1. The Business Transaction. Let's start with the fundamental truth that will shatter any romantic notions you might have. Roman marriage wasn't about love. It wasn't even about the 2 people getting married. Roman marriage was a business transaction between 2 families, and the bride and groom were essentially the merchandise being traded. The Latin term for marriage, matrimonium, literally means motherhood duty. Not partnership, not companionship, motherhood duty. That tells you everything you need to know about what Romans expected from their wives. Marriages were arranged by the pater familias, the male head of the household, who held absolute power over his family. When I say absolute, I mean absolute. He could legally kill his own children if he chose to. So when he decided who you'd marry, that wasn't a suggestion, it was a command that could mean life or death. These arrangements were purely strategic. Maybe your family needed a political alliance. Maybe they needed access to trade routes. Maybe they just needed money. Your personal feelings about spending the rest of your life with someone were completely irrelevant. And here's the kicker. Divorce was just as transactional. If the political situation changed, if a better opportunity came along, marriages could be dissolved as easily as they were formed. The wife would simply be sent back to her father's house, like a returned item that didn't work out. Chapter 2. The Child Brides. Now let's talk about something that will make your stomach turn. The age of Roman brides. While Roman law technically set the minimum age for marriage at 12 for girls and 14 for boys, in practice, girls were often married even younger, 12 years old. Let that sink in for a moment. At an age when modern children are just starting middle school, Roman girls were expected to manage households, bear children, and fulfill the duties of a wife to a man who could be decades older. The Romans actually had a term for the ideal bride, virgo intacta, an untouched virgin. The younger, the better. Some girls were betrothed as infants and married the moment they hit puberty. Their fathers would literally inspect them to ensure their purity before handing them over to their new husbands. But here's what makes this even more horrifying. These weren't considered children by Roman standards. The moment a girl had her first menstrual cycle, she was considered a woman ready for marriage and childbearing. There was no concept of adolescence, no time to develop emotionally or mentally before being thrust into adult responsibilities. The wedding night for these child brides was essentially legalized rape. They had no knowledge of what was expected of them, no preparation beyond being told it was their duty to submit to their husbands. Many of these girls died in childbirth because their bodies simply weren't developed enough to handle pregnancy and delivery. Chapter 3. The Wedding Ceremony from Hell. Roman wedding ceremonies weren't the joyful celebrations we might imagine. They were elaborate displays of the transfer of property. And yes, the bride was the property being transferred. The ceremony began with the bride being literally torn from her mother's arms in a ritual called raptio, a symbolic kidnapping that represented her being taken from her birth family. She would be dressed in a specific outfit, a white tunic tied with a woolen belt that only her husband could untie, and a flame-colored veil that covered her face. But here's the most disturbing part. The bride's hair was styled with a spear point, not a comb, not a decorative pin, a spear point. This was supposed to represent the violence of conquest, because that's essentially what marriage was, the conquest of a woman by a man. The ceremony included sacrificing animals and examining their entrails to ensure the gods approved of the union. If the omens were bad, the wedding could be postponed, but only temporarily. The business arrangement had already been made. After the ceremony, the bride was paraded through the streets to her new home, while crowds threw nuts and made crude sexual jokes about what would happen on the wedding night. She wasn't allowed to cross the threshold on her own. She had to be carried over by her husband, symbolizing that she couldn't even enter her new life under her own power. Chapter 4. Life as a Roman wife. Once married, a Roman woman's life was defined by three primary duties: bearing children, managing the household, and staying completely faithful to her husband, while he was free to have affairs with slaves, prostitutes, and other men's wives. The pressure to produce children, specifically male children, was enormous. A wife who couldn't conceive was considered defective merchandise. Her husband could divorce her and send her back to her family in disgrace. Even worse, if she did conceive but gave birth to daughters, she was considered a failure. Roman women had no legal identity separate from their male relatives. They couldn't own property, couldn't make contracts, couldn't even have their own names. They were simply given feminine versions of their father's name. Marcus's daughter would be called Marcia. Gaius's daughter would be Gaia. Inside the home, wives were expected to be invisible when male guests were present. They ate separately, spoke only when spoken to, and spent their days spinning wool. Even wealthy women were expected to demonstrate their virtue through this humble domestic task. But perhaps most shocking of all was the complete double standard regarding adultery. If a Roman wife was caught with another man, both she and her lover could be legally executed by her husband or father. But Roman men were not only allowed, but expected to have sexual relationships outside marriage. They had concubines, visited prostitutes, and engaged in relationships with their slaves, both male and female, and this was considered completely normal. Chapter 5. The reality of Roman divorce. Roman divorce was supposedly easy. Either party could simply declare the marriage over. But this apparent freedom was another cruel illusion for women. When a marriage ended, the woman lost everything. Her children belonged to their father and stayed with him. Any property she had brought to the marriage might or might not be returned to her family, depending on the terms of the original contract. She would return to her father's house as a burden, damaged goods that would be difficult to remarry. For men, divorce was a strategic tool. They could divorce wives who had become politically inconvenient, who had failed to produce male heirs, or who had simply grown older and less attractive. Many powerful Romans went through multiple wives, like we go through cars, upgrading whenever something better came along. The most famous example is probably Pompey the Great, who divorced his wife to marry Julius Caesar's daughter for political reasons, then later divorced her when the political winds changed. These women weren't people to him. They were chess pieces in his game for power. Some women were divorced and remarried so many times they lost count. They were passed around between powerful families like trading cards, never allowed to form lasting bonds or build stable lives. Chapter 6. The exception that proved the rule. Now, you might be thinking, surely there were some happy Roman marriages, some women who found love and respect, and you'd be right. There were exceptions, but they were so rare that they actually prove how horrible the system usually was. We have inscriptions from tombstones where Roman husbands praised wives who died young, describing them as perfect because they were obedient, silent, and fertile. The fact that these qualities were worth commemorating tells us everything about what was expected. Some wealthy, educated women from powerful families did manage to carve out positions of influence. Women like Livia, Augustus's wife, wielded considerable behind-the-scenes power, but they were the exception, not the rule, and their power came through manipulation and political maneuvering, not through any recognized rights. Even these successful Roman women had to be incredibly careful. Too much visibility or influence could backfire spectacularly. Women who were seen as overstepping their bounds could be accused of adultery, treason, or corrupting Roman values, charges that could lead to exile or execution. Final chapter. Conclusion. So, the next time you see a movie depicting Roman marriage as romantic or glamorous, remember the reality. 12-year-old girls sold into sexual slavery that was called marriage, women treated as breeding stock and household managers, lives controlled entirely by male relatives who could dispose of them at will. Roman marriage wasn't a partnership between equals. It was legalized ownership of women by men, dressed up in religious ceremony and social tradition. The fact that some couples managed to find genuine affection within this brutal system doesn't make the system any less horrifying. It makes you realize just how far we've come and how vigilant we need to be to protect the rights and freedoms that previous generations of women could never have imagined. What aspect of Roman marriage shocked you the most? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more dark truths about history that they don't teach you in school.